We might be a small island, but we've got an epic history. And there's a wealth of untold secrets still to uncover. So every year, hundreds of archaeologists dig, dive, and sift to find clues.
Absolutely
Never seen anything
like it before.
It's just amazing.
In 2018, their discoveries have been more exciting than ever.
Look at that.
So that's from a tank then? That's brilliant. That's a nice find.
Not bad for day 2.
Not bad at all.
Each excavation has been filmed as it happened by the archaeologists themselves. Their dig diaries mean that we can be there for every exciting moment of discovery.
And you imagine him looking over his shoulder, trying to get away from the enemy aircraft through that.
I'll be in the lab where the teams will bring in their finds from pottery and metalwork to human remains, and we'll take a closer look to find out what these new digs can tell us about our ancestors. Look at that.
Be very careful.
I will be careful. Oh my goodness. While archaeologist Raksha Dave looks into the analysis that goes on long after a dig is finished.
Somebody stabbed her in the back of the head. What an awful way to go.
Welcome to Digging for Britain. In this programme, I'm joining archaeologists in the east of Britain and beyond as they share their biggest discoveries. We join a team as they find an incredible lost Stone Age monument.
It has to mean something, and it's now our job is to figure out what it does mean.
And we uncover an unusual Roman burial site that seems to defy explanation.
This is actually the 17th out of 32 which show deviancy in the form of decapitation.
And at Norwich Castle Museum, I'll discover how one of the objects held here helps us to tell the story of Eastern Britain. First, we travel a bit further east than usual to investigate the key World War I battle of Bullecourt in a French foreign field that is forever England. By 1917, a devastating land war had been raging in Europe for 3 years. That spring, Germany made the strategic decision to retreat behind a massive fortified defence they'd constructed across northern France. It was known to the British as the Hindenburg Line. The line was almost impenetrable with a set of 6 trenches, and in front of that another 90 metres of barbed wire. The Allies had to breach it, though, or face the terrible prospect of an even longer war. So the British decided to try out their latest, barely tested invention, the tank. The plan at Bullecourt was straightforward. 12 British tanks would advance to the Hindenburg Line, crash through the defences, followed by troops of Australian infantry. But in the end, it was a disaster. Only 2 tanks got anywhere near the line, leading to a catastrophic loss of Australian life. The Australians felt badly betrayed, and one general even accused the tank crews of cowardice. MOD archaeologist Richard Osgood is leading this battlefield dig.
What we're looking for is the points where the tanks of the British Army attacked in 1917, and to find out why they were destroyed where they were, to answer the question that was levelled at some of the crews that they perhaps lacked moral fibre. Maybe there's an element of cowardice in some ways, not helping to assist the Australian infantry in their attack on the German Hindenburg Line.
The team have an idea where they might find one of these tanks, because the Germans took photographs of it after their victory. Richard's archaeologists are ex-soldiers from Britain, Australia, and Germany.
Well, the edge of the trench is about here, so it has a little slope in it.
They've served in recent conflicts from Afghanistan to Iraq, giving them an insight into war's worst realities. And it doesn't take long before they find evidence of the Hindenburg Line's brutal design.
What we'd picture up here
German barbed wire. You can see it's really thick, it's well over-engineered. Pretty nasty stuff. You'll certainly get tangled up in that and be shot, no doubt.
And then Richard's team are brought face to face with the tragic consequences of this battle for Bulgur, a reminder that there were casualties on both sides.
This chap here is a German casualty lying in the Hindenburg line. This is his skull. He's facing this way. He seems to be in quite a mess, doesn't he, Isabel? He's kind of twisted this way. The vertebrae suddenly stop there.
They can tell from the equipment around him that he was a German soldier. It's important to these former soldiers to take a moment to remember the fallen.
War is a great leveller. He's a human being. He could be British, he could be Australian, he could be French. In this case, he's German. And it's all exactly the same.
Ja, Headless, Kamerad. This is not easy, but as 100 years ago, we might have fought against each other. But because of this war, we're now standing here together. Not as enemies, but as friends. Auf dich, Kamerad.
Fallen comrades.
Fallen comrades.
The next day, the team continue their quest for the tank.
I can't believe we're making so many finds already. We've got lots of tank parts that are coming out of the ground. We've got parts of the engine, we've got parts of the driving chain, we've got some of the components from within the tank as well.
Because of the documentary evidence and photos, Richard knows that he's looking at the remains of Tank 796, commanded by Lieutenant Hugh Skinner. And the only tank that made it all the way to the Hindenburg line. It broke down in a crater in full view of the German artillery. In the reports of the battle, written by Australian generals, British tank crews were accused of cowardice and incompetence. So is it possible that Skinner and his crew abandoned their Australian allies?
Got some tank armour.
Oh, right, that's part of the plate from the side, is it?
Yes.
So look, being in an armoured vehicle with something like this, I mean, is that going to protect you against shell blast?
No, not at all. Protects you against small arms.
So against bullets, good.
Bullets.
Against shells, that's really not going to work.
No.
So that's pretty terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah.
The armour plating was clearly not able to withstand the firepower it faced. With his tank immobilised and under heavy fire, Skinner and his crew would have been sitting ducks, so the last find of the dig is a revelation.
Leave it there, Paul. And that's possibly the end of a shell. Okay.
It's hollow.
Okay, we'll keep cleaning it. That looks a
Cart case.
I think so.
cartridge.
It's got curvature.
So in which case we
regular
need to
curvature
get
on it.
Dave over to have a look. Brush.
It was a £6 kit.
Well, that's what the guys have been thinking.
Yeah, that's what it is, £6 kit.
So that's from a tank then?
Yeah.
That's brilliant. That's a nice find.
This empty casing suggests a £6 tank shell was fired on this very spot. They were firing the remains of their ammo until the bitter end.
When the tank was basically broken down here, in his report he said he carried on firing, trying to use as much of his ammunition up as possible before they retreated to the Australian and British lines over there. And this kind of proves that he was firing from this spot where the tank was broken.
So this item is, yeah, it's a symbol of bravery.
I've asked Richard to join me in the lab to share the powerful evidence he's uncovered to contradict the Australian accusations of cowardice.
This is basically the archaeology of a day. This is the archaeology of one day in April 1917 and the traces it leaves behind in these French fields.
Have you found out anything else that we couldn't have known just from the history that's come down to us?
Yes. I mean, the armour, it's just metal. It's not armoured as we'd understand it. It's that sort of level of thickness. It's really great for stopping bullets, but not for stopping artillery. The crews must have known that very, very quickly, and it must have been just terrifying. So these are the tanks that are brought in for training for the British Army. They've used them on the Somme in 1916, but this is going to be the breakthrough weapon, but they're only for training. I suppose shock and awe is the thing they were trying to achieve, of having this monster attacking the infantry, and that's great if you can't shoot through it.
I mean, it seems extraordinary that you're saying that essentially this is a training tank. I mean, this tank is firing shells of that size, and presumably the Germans are firing back similar size
Pretty
shells.
similar. This is a 6-pounder case, and the Germans are firing back 7.7 centimetre artillery, which is pretty much the same sort of size, and it was going straight through the metal of these tanks.
And what's this image here?
We all think we know what colours the tanks are, and the only way you can really tell what the original paint was like on these things is if you find it in the ground. And we were incredibly fortunate to find that paint on one of the tracks of 796. So you've got two colours there. You've got the red, which is the undercoat, and then a green tone on top of it. That colour is British racing green.
Yeah.
On a thing that does 4 miles an hour.
Does that make them stand out more, do you think?
Well, they've done all sorts of different colour schemes, and they're experimenting. It's such a new weapon. They're even experimenting with the colours that are going on to this thing. People are learning lessons and desperately trying to break through this huge siege that's going on the Western Front.
So the Germans had nothing like this?
No, nothing at all. In fact, the main use of tanks that the Germans have in the First World War are captured British tanks, Beutpanzer. It's a bit of a Pyrrhic victory in some ways, in that the Germans look at the results of the fire that they put out against these tanks and where they've destroyed them and how they've destroyed them, and they employ those tactics later on in other battles. But by then, the British are not using training tanks. They're using properly armoured vehicles.
Right.
And that leads to successes like the Battle of Cambrai just a few months later, where they are much more effective vehicles.
And what about this tale of cowardice, then? I mean, where does this excavation leave us?
Well, hopefully that's dispelled any sorts of thoughts like that. It comes from the Australians, who took a lot of casualties in this one particular battle, perhaps looking for a scapegoat, and these tank crews were that obvious example to pin it on. The fact that this tank got as far as it did, it fired until its ammunition was either expended or the tank was utterly unable to maintain itself without being destroyed. It does 4 miles an hour over a big area. They've seen the other tanks being destroyed. To stay as long as they did and to get as far as they did, I think actually it's quite the reverse. I think it's a tale of courage.
Yeah. This excavation shows that the tragic failure at Bulcourt was a failure of machines and not men. We now know that the crew of Tank 796 fought bravely until their very last shell. We go back to the UK now, where archaeologists are investigating a huge 37-kilometre-long stretch of farmland before the laying of a power line near Woodbridge. Every time a major UK building project is greenlit, then maps have to be consulted, the land is surveyed, and often an excavation is carried out. Now, the archaeologists don't set out to make spectacular finds, but sometimes they will uncover a major new discovery, and that's exactly what happened this year in Suffolk. The Suffolk landscape has been ploughed and levelled for centuries. So when the commercial archaeologists started work, expectations were low. But right at the end of the project, the survey showed something interesting hidden under the soil. When they start to dig, they get a huge surprise. It looks like this very flat patch of land was once a hill, and under the flattened hill, they uncover a monumental curving ditch.
The scale of the ditch is massive. It's about 15 metres wide. It's at least 2 to 3 metres deep. That is a very, very large feature, which would have been huge in the landscape when it was around.
Digging this ditch must have been a colossal undertaking, suggesting that this was a very important site. Through the bitterly cold winter, the team works as fast and as carefully as they can, peeling back each layer of earth filling the ditch. Then comes the next shock. There's a perfectly preserved wooden trackway inside the ditch that would have led to the top of the hill.
The trackway itself came down on a ramp just beside us on split oak timbers, and then runs up along the centre of the ring ditch and terminates at the very highest point on the hill.
With no precedent for such a strange design, The team don't know if they're looking at something that is hundreds or thousands of years old. But it's clear that they've unearthed an enormous monument and something that had been entirely forgotten about. As the trackway emerges, the archaeologists can see that it's about 3 meters wide, and further analysis reveals it's made of birch and oak. The big question is now when this mysterious monument was constructed and why. And they start to find objects that appear to have been deliberately placed in the ditch.
There's an obvious placing of certain bones in certain locations along the trackway, but we're finding none of the other bones. We're only finding pelvic bones and jaw bones, which is sort of the front of the animal and the back of the animal, but nothing in between. And that in itself is extraordinarily unusual.
The wood and the bone can be dated, and they turn out to be very old indeed. They're from 2400 BCE, so this feature is Stone Age. At this time, we know that people were gathering to create giant monuments in significant places in the landscape. The most famous of these, of course, is Stonehenge, which also has a large, curving ditch around it. But there the similarities end. This new discovery, though, raises the possibility that many more giant monuments could be hidden in our landscape, each one unique and each with its own purpose. This henge-like monument has one last important secret. The team finds a large platform at the top of the hill, built to hold the weight of many people.
So we're standing on the highest point on the hillside where the ring ditch occurs, and you can see behind us the remains of the supporting structure for the depositional platform.
And not only that, there are natural springs on site that seem to have been redirected to fill the ditch with water. The wooden trackway and platform would have allowed people to walk over the water, and it seems that they were deliberately dropping objects like the animal bone into it. This is an extraordinary, unique and puzzling feat of ancient engineering.
We think that it's part of the actual ceremonial purpose of the platform, is that people come to the top of it and they deposit material to run down along the hillside in the flowing water.
It is difficult to think of a functional reason for building a structure like this, and the archaeologists believe it had a ritual purpose.
That makes this an almost magical experience, and if you're coming in from the creek below, the water will be rushing down on either side like a large prehistoric water feature.
For site director Vinny, this is the find of a lifetime.
It has been a phenomenal site, once in a career site for me, and I think for everybody here, they've witnessed nothing of the likes of what we've excavated over the last 7 months. It's been a real roller coaster.
I've asked the team into the lab to explain how this remarkable site is changing our knowledge of the ritual landscape of prehistoric Britain. That is an incredible site. And is it a henge? Can we describe it as that?
I think it's certainly related to those sorts of things. Henges, we now know, relate to water and the use of water and presumably the veneration of the ancestors and the journey to the afterlife. It's quite possible that people had their feet in the water when they were walking along the trackway. It's not a place where they were living and it's an occupation site. It's a site with a special function.
So, yeah, this is the elephant in the room. we've been kind of ignoring this, but it's absolutely magnificent. So this is a prehistoric cow.
A very large prehistoric cow.
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely...
A very large one that we were very pleased to see.
Yeah.
Because it allowed us to have an indication of what date we were dealing with, because when you find an aurochs, it tells you that whatever you've got, it's Middle Bronze Age or earlier, because they are extinct in Britain as of the Middle Bronze Age.
And where did you find it?
So we found this just off the end of the platform, just within arm's reach, so it's deposited off the side. And along with that, we found this wooden bladed agricultural artifact as well.
So it's not just a piece of wood?
No, it's a wooden spatula, and it's used for butter and milk churning. It's the same thing. You're getting the association of agricultural practices with the auroch skull in the placement at the edge of this platform.
I mean, these are the earliest farmers, aren't they? This is, early Neolithic. This is the beginning of farming in Britain.
From the carbon-14 dating that we've just recently had back, we're looking at it to be about 3,500 BC.
So that's really early Neolithic.
Very early, and that's from the lowest phase of the trackway, so the very first phase of trackway.
And when we're thinking of this time period, we're always kind of drawn to Stonehenge, just because that is such an obvious feature still in our landscape. But it's quite curious to see that there were things like this that have been forgotten about.
Stonehenge is famous for its kind of lifespan. Now, what we can tell from this site in particular is that it has a similar lifespan. Outside of our site, from the surveying that we've done also, we can see there's a much larger sequence of monumental activity in that whole valley side, which is prehistoric. It's something that those people and their descendants have kept coming back to for thousands of years.
This astonishing site reveals that our prehistoric ancestors came together to build a spectacular water feature and returned here over more than 1,000 years. But unlike Stonehenge, this monument was flattened and lost until now. It's still early days, but the Woodbridge site looks set to become the stuff of archaeological legend. We cover many exciting digs on this series, but in fact, the excavation is only the start of a long journey of discovery. Once finds and samples are retrieved, they're sent off to labs for conservation and analysis, a process that can take weeks, months, sometimes even years. And for this next dig in Chichester, it is only when the samples arrive in the lab that the real details begin to emerge. Field archaeologist Raksha Dave is travelling to Portslade to find out how post-excavation work following a Chichester dig is making sense of Britain's lost landscapes.
For the last 2 years, Southern Water have been laying a 10-kilometre pipeline cutting through town and country, and they paid Archaeology Southeast to monitor their work. As they dug the areas where the pipes were to be laid, they found prehistoric henges, Roman settlement and burial, and RAF bases from World War II. But most intriguingly, they have unearthed a buried medieval village.
There are an awful lot of buckets here.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. So these are just some of the hundreds of samples that we've recovered from the village itself. They are soil, basically, from archaeological deposits, like, for example, fields of ditches and pits.
So you've got a plan here.
As they excavated along the line of the future water pipe and uncovered the footprint of the lost village, they mapped the details.
So you can see there's boundary ditches, there's post holes relating to structures.
To access this time capsule of medieval life, they've dug up entire sections of the ground and brought them back to the lab. The clues to the people who lived in this village are hidden in the soil. But first, they need to get rid of a lot of mud.
Good grief. Then do I just break these bits up then?
Yeah. So all we're trying to do is break it down. So the water will do some of the work for us.
This is quite a bizarre job.
It is.
It's like, what do you do for a living? Oh, I wash mud.
It's almost like massaging it, though, so it's very intimate. What we're trying to do is get rid of all the soil, so we end up with all the lovely archaeological material.
I can actually feel all the tiny bits.
Yeah. And this one, on top of this mesh, will have all the heavy stuff that won't float, but then some lighter things like charcoal and plant remains will float, and we'll end up with them in this smaller one.
The large tank at the top will catch stone, tile and metal, and the small mesh below it catches lighter plant remains.
So how do you then use all of this information about this organic remains to paint a picture of village life?
If, for example, we have a sample with lots of charcoal in it, it could be from an oven or a kiln. We can identify certain types of charcoal as being fuel wood.
Yeah, so you can see where they're selecting certain types of trees to burn, or if they're avoiding any, whether they're cutting down trees to use as fuel, or whether they are just picking from the forest floor.
It just amazes me how much information you can get from such a tiny piece of charcoal.
Extracting all of this information requires an expert eye. So they are passed to archaeobotanist Angela for analysis. Gosh, this is quite painstaking stuff.
And then I listen to music when I do.
These innocuous bits of seed and charcoal can give us an intimate insight into the everyday lives of the people in this village. Germinated grains showed that they were brewing ale. The charcoal shows us where they were cooking, and the cereal can tell us about the bread they were eating.
In medieval times, both wheat and barley were used for making flour because wheat was a bit of a high-status cereal, so not everybody could afford to eat bread that was made entirely out of wheat.
After all of these samples are sorted and analysed, the team will be able to work out what people were doing in different parts of the site. And the larger finds from the excavation are providing intriguing clues to the village's fate.
Where has this material come from?
Well, all of this tile has come from a spread that was overlying one side of the best preserved house that we had on the site.
We know that there are 2,000 fragments of tile here weighing close to 40 kilograms, and that's a significantly large amount to get from a single feature.
Tile was a valuable resource and often reused. Such a large quantity left untouched after the building's collapse suggests that the entire village was abandoned.
So it's literally collapsed down and all the tiles just spread onto the ground?
Where it drops, yeah.
The fabric of this particular tile is quite distinctive. You can see it's got quite large flint inclusions. And we can say that it's between 1150 and 1350 AD.
This medieval date gives an important clue as to why this village disappeared.
But that's a classic feature of the deserted medieval village in the mid-14th century, where you just get, obviously, massive depopulation. You're going through a cold phase that hits around the time, the so-called Little Ice Age. That has a knock-on effect with, like, an impact on food, on harvests. You've got the Black Death rolls in around that time. You've got the 100 Years' War as well, which would have been a drain on the population. When you combine them all together, it must have been pretty devastating.
The date of this collapsed building shows that the perfect storm of climate change, disease, and political turmoil signalled the end for this particular village. It's early days, but it's likely these buckets of mud hold many more of the village's secrets for the archaeologists to uncover.
Our next site takes us to the village of Great Wellnatham in Suffolk, where a team were brought in to investigate a small field ahead of a housing project, because evidence of Roman activity had already been found in the surrounding area. This dig is making us question Roman burial practice in Britain.
When it comes to the Romans, a fort or a villa looks very similar whether it's in northern Africa or eastern Britain. So archaeologists often half know what they're going to find even before they start digging. But some sites defy all the expectations.
When the team arrived on site, they found evidence of burials. There's nothing unusual about this, but it meant the site had to be fully excavated. 5 weeks in, they make what seems to be a gruesome discovery.
So I've got a child between about 4 and 8 years old, and he's what we call a deviant burial, which means it's been placed in an unusual way or buried in an unusual practice. You can see the head has been removed from where it should be and is in between the legs. So we've got the arms coming down like this, the 2 legs on either side which are spread, and the head right in the middle.
There are examples of strange burials like this, decapitated with the head rearranged, from other Roman cemeteries, but they're rare, and we don't know why the dead body would be treated in this way. As the dig continues, there are plenty of more normal-looking graves, so it looks like the deviant burial is a one-off. But it isn't.
So far, I'm uncovering this grave where we have this skeleton, possibly deviant. We're not entirely sure yet if the skull belongs to the skeleton, but I believe it could be from this skeleton because by the pelvis and by the skull, it seems to be female.
This burial is even stranger than the last.
We also have feet, but they do not belong to this skeleton, so it's obvious that we have several redeposits on the same grave.
This body appears to have been buried with an extra pair of feet, which must have been removed from their owner, fully fleshed. Over the next few days, more deviant burials emerge.
We're missing the top vertebrae from over here, so it's very likely that this skull does belong to this individual, and we've got clear evidence of decapitation having occurred on site, so we've got yet another deviant burial.
We have another presumed decapitation where the head has been placed underneath the lower limbs.
And we have Brunner excavating our 17th decapitation burial. This is actually the 17th out of 32 which show deviancy in the form of decapitation, with the head out of its correct anatomical position.
Well over half of the people buried in this cemetery have been decapitated, and even more peculiarly, several have extra body parts with them. This is a large number of deviant burials for a single cemetery. So what does it mean? I've asked Rebecca Redfern from the Museum of London and lead archaeologist Kerry Bull into the lab to help solve this mystery.
I suppose what's absolutely crucial to understand about this, we talk about decapitation, but what we need to try to understand is whether that is somebody being beheaded as the cause of their death, or whether actually they're already dead and you're removing the head of a dead body.
I think in this case, with this particular woman, I think we're seeing more of a funerary ritual rather than as an execution. I mean, the cemetery is very strange.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, what we do seem to have all of the decapitation burials, they have purposely moved the head from anatomical position, and they tend to have it in the lower limb area, so it seemed to have been important to them to remove that head and put them somewhere else, whereas normally with some sort of execution burials, all you need to do is chop off the head and kill them.
I mean, I think this is obviously part of a culture where if this is happening after death, this is just what you do with a dead body, and it's kind of assumed in the same way that, what we do with dead bodies now is cremate them, grind them up and put them in a pot. And there's not necessarily thought going into that process every time. But where do you think it comes from? What's the motivation?
it's really interesting because a lot of the time, a lot of the decapitation or even prone burials, so people are buried face down or in unusual positions, they're covered with stones. And so we think that is like definitely we are making sure you never come back.
So can you tell anything about this other individual here?
I mean, this lady appears to have experienced quite a physical lifestyle. If we look at her elbow joint, it's very shiny. So it's lovely and shiny. Yeah,
look like ivory, doesn't it? So she's lost all the cartilage there.
Yeah, in her elbow and then again in her wrist at the bottom of the ulna.
Yeah.
And then her finger phalanges, one appears to be broken and one appears to be infected. And there seems to be a little bit of joint disease as well in her skeleton, and all of the maxillary teeth have been lost for quite a long time because it's all pinched back together, and it's made her face look very kind of caved in. It's not something that I would really expect to see because she doesn't appear to be that old.
Do we have any idea who these people might have been? Where they stood in Roman society?
There's a site down the road where they've actually found a slave manacle of around about the same period, and so maybe we could have a funerary rite associated with slave burials, and that's why we're getting a lot of this degenerative bone disease, reflecting that kind of lifestyle.
Do you think that's a reasonable hypothesis?
I think so. For the Romans to really kind of get the rural economy going, they have to import a huge number of people, both from the continent, but also they're moving people around Britain and they're enslaved.
And that's really interesting too, because when we look at Roman Britain, we're often talking about the civilised nature of it. But here we've got something that prefigures medieval serfdom.
Oh, absolutely. We know one of the big exports in the late Iron Age are slaves from Britain. So the Romans just really ramp that part of the economy up. And also the fact that anyone could be a slave. You get people who may not show us that they've suffered a hard childhood because they might have had a fairly affluent life but then become enslaved as adults. And that's what we're seeing. So it's very, very complicated. But for me, for the research that I've done, I would say this is very convincing.
That this is a slave cemetery?
Yes.
We still don't really understand why these bodies were decapitated. But by identifying these people as slaves, the cemetery could help to shed light on that darker side of Roman rule. Now we travel forward in time 1,200 years to Hampshire and a chance discovery of a stash of coins that might throw some light on one of the most turbulent periods in our British history. In April 2018, Canadian metal detectorist Darcy Fear was holidaying in Hampshire. Back home, he'd been passionate about his hobby for decades, even though he'd had little success.
Thursday morning, it was a beautiful day. I started metal detecting, and it was my first signal. I was only there 10, 15 minutes. And I was just so amazed that I found something so incredible.
Darcy's holiday was about to become the archaeological experience of a lifetime.
When I dug the top of the soil and then I saw the first bit of pottery on the ground, well then the last shovelful, when we lifted it out, it was just coins everywhere. So it was, we knew what we had then, or I did anyway, so yeah.
Incredibly, having just arrived in the UK, Darcy had discovered a hoard of buried coins. All the visible ones were nearly 400 years old. They'd probably been hidden here in the Civil War.
During the English Civil War, the country was split, torn apart by fighting between Charles I's Royalists and Cromwell's Roundheads. But while the history books can provide us with details of the battles and the bloodsheds, the names of leaders even, archaeology reveals the details of ordinary lives.
Although on foreign turf, Darcy knew exactly what he should do when he made his discovery.
I know the rules, so we're not supposed to touch anything once you find a hoard. So we didn't until we got a hold of an archaeologist. By the end of the day, they finally let us dig it ourselves.
Having sought permission and then with careful supervision, the hoard was lifted.
Then we put the whole thing into a bucket to keep it together and then cover it with a wet rag. And then, the bucket alone weighed 100 pounds, just with mostly dirt.
By taking such care, Darcy and the archaeologists hope that they've removed the entire hoard in a single block. And then the conservation team at the British Museum take over.
Very quickly after I started excavating, I started seeing the rim of the vessel, which was very lucky because then I realized this is what I was working with.
The pot looks to be intact, meaning that it could be just as its owner had placed it there 400 years ago. So Dugu begins to work very slowly and methodically.
This is really a micro excavation, so if I was on site, excavating your find, this is exactly I would be doing it, yeah.
Dugu carries out this mini dig with almost surgical skill, and she notices something remarkable about the way the coins were placed inside the pot.
It looks like in this layer that I've been excavating, the coins are stuck next to each other and upwards.
It's hard to believe, really, to find something like this.
Senior conservator Pippa Pearce thinks that the owner of the hoard had sorted the money into neat little stacks, someone who clearly intended to come back to them.
Because that would mean that they were in a hurry, they weren't about to be murdered, they weren't counting their money out neatly and then just putting it into a pot and hiding it.
And the stacks of silver coins just keep on coming.
So we've got 23 coins out at the moment. You reckon there's as many again or more?
I think there's 200 coins in there.
Whoa!
The coins are in great condition despite being in the ground for so long.
So you can see his beard.
These ones are in nice
Yes,
shape. You see
very
you can
little corrosion,
See the
yeah.
dates on those ones as plain as day. Amazing.
So to have what is a really good condition hoard and to be able to excavate it in the lab is just brilliant for us.
So why did this person bury their wealth? I'm speaking to British Museum coin expert Barry Cook to find out more about this incredible hoard.
So we've got Edward VI all the way through Elizabeth, James, through to Charles. what's the time depth there?
We have 100 years, pretty much, of English monarchy.
Yeah.
We could have had older coins, except that Henry VIII debased the coinage and left it in a terrible state. So it was up to his children, Edward VI, Mary and Elizabeth, to try and sort that out. Edward and Mary both issued good silver coins, but they didn't get rid of the terrible stuff. Elizabeth came in and got rid of all the bad money.
Yeah.
So Civil War hoards, the oldest coin will often be an Edward VI or a Mary coin.
Yeah. I mean, it seems quite extraordinary to us today, I think, to imagine that people were still using coins that were 100 years old and they were still,
Yes, you're too
they were
young.
still
You're
currency.
too young. I can remember Edward VII coins when I was young, pre-decimisation.
Yeah.
The coins didn't change. And you don't withdraw the coins because the ruler died, you keep them there.
So, who else have we got?
James I. There are some coins that have dates on, but most coins of this period do not have dates on.
Oh,
but the mint organised its production by putting a little mark on, so we can date those.
And then finally...
Charles, this is the nice shilling of Charles. He's telling us a shilling. It says 12 for 12 pence.
Yeah, so he's the last one.
He's the latest one in the hoard, and the hoard ends with a lot of coins of his from one particular mint mark, which is called triangle and circle, because obviously it's a triangle inside a circle. And that was the mark that was being used between 1641 and 1643.
Right.
And that's really important, because in 1642, the King leaves London, the Civil War starts.
Yeah.
So this is the coin issue being produced as the Civil War is just beginning.
Yeah.
And you get a lot of coin hoards that end at this time, so everyone is hiding their money.
And is there anything else unusual about this? I mean, the scratching out of faces seems to be quite odd. Is that something we often see?
Yes, to a degree. It's not every hoard has got these scratches, but enough of them do for it to be a serious phenomenon of the period.
Yeah.
We don't really understand why they did it. And this hoard is typical in the sense that most of the scratch coins are shillings, and most of the scratch coins are Elizabeth. So if you would imagine if there was a political motive during the Civil War of scratching the King's face out, it's going to be Charles, it's not Elizabeth. Elizabeth was viewed as in a more positive light. She was the comparison against which the Stuarts failed.
Yeah. So what is the explanation for these scratches, then?
I'm inclined to think there is some sort of practical explanation. You might just be keeping track. You might be accounting them. It might be the top one in the pile. It could be something like that. Who knows?
So with a coin hoard like this, sometimes with earlier coin hoards, we're left wondering whether perhaps they're votive offerings or people burying their wealth at this point.
This is pure hiding your economic wealth and hoping to come back to it.
Yeah.
We're in the point where England is collapsing, disintegrating, and people are hiding their coins, hiding everything they can get and putting it in the ground. And generally speaking, the hoards are found across the country where the two sides are meeting.
Right.
They sort of sweep down in about Yorkshire and through the Midlands and where the King's headquarters was, into the West Country where the two armies were always meeting. They do reflect how the war was working.
They reflect that clash.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of the wealth that was buried here, can you give me an equivalent?
It's £13, 4 shillings and 6pence.
Yeah, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but how much was it then?
But that's very easily an annual salary of a worker.
Yeah. They
used to say that Elizabethan gentlemen should be able to live off £10 a year.
Right.
We're a bit later now, but you know, £13 is a good income for pretty much anyone who wasn't a gentleman or a really rich trader.
Yeah. So in that pot, we've got a small fortune.
Yeah, so we have somebody's annual wages.
Yeah. And they never came back to retrieve it.
Something happened.
Mm.
Next, we travel to Coldingham, right at the English-Scottish border, in pursuit of a powerful but forgotten Anglo-Saxon princess. This site lies just across the water from the famous Lindisfarne Abbey. Lindisfarne was founded by King Oswald, who is still famous today for transforming Britain into a Christian country. But the role his sister played has often been overlooked. Rejecting the traditional option of marriage, Princess Ebba became an abbess and played a crucial part in the spread of this religion. But the precise location of her monastery has proved elusive. A team of archaeologists and volunteers from Dig Ventures is hoping to put Ebba back into the story of how Christianity spread.
So hold something on this side. Yeah.
So we're here at Coldingham looking for St Ebba's Monastery, an Anglo-Saxon double monastery that we think was somewhere around the location.
The abbey that Ebba established would have acted as a vital link between the evangelical monks of Lindisfarne and the people on the mainland they needed to reach. The hunt starts near a later Norman priory, often placed on the site of an older abbey. But the remains of these Saxon abbeys are incredibly elusive. There are often no stone buildings to find, so even discovering the site of a chapel can be difficult. But there usually is a marked boundary.
We've started to clean back along this trench, and what's really exciting is we've started to find some archaeological features. What we think we found is a ditch which is similar to the 7th century ditch found in earlier excavations.
A ditch dating to the 7th century was found in a nearby field 13 years ago. And if this new ditch connects to that one, it could suggest that they're on the very edge of the monastery site. The team have just 12 more days to find solid evidence. But with a good start like this, they're feeling confident.
Might be a tiny bit of tile or something.
But then some surprising material begins to emerge.
Bones coming out of everywhere. This whole layer is full of it.
These are animal bones.
We are halfway through week 2 and we have loads and loads of animal bone, which makes me desperate and happy at the same time. Happy because it's really exciting, but desperate because we only have 4 days to clean it all.
While heaps of animal bones might not be the evidence the team was expecting, it is interesting. The quantity of animal bones suggests that something more than just the consumption of meat was happening here.
We might have a tannery here making leather, glue, tallow for candles. There's all sorts of things that have been using animals for.
The bones and the boundary ditch won't reveal their secrets until long after this short dig is over and dating work can be done. But it's a promising start to an archaeological quest to give Ebba the recognition she deserves. Even when women held positions of power and were written about in historical texts, they seem to have been selectively forgotten about. 300 miles south in Essex, another team is uncovering the story of another powerful Anglo-Saxon woman. A new shopping centre is planned for the centre of Barking, giving the team from Thames Valley Archaeological Services a chance to dig. And they're on the trail of another elusive monastery. In Anglo-Saxon Britain, the growth and success of a town was often linked to the presence of an economically powerful abbey. And in Barking, that success built on the work of a princess called Ethelberga, who we know founded the first monastery there. Our next dig is providing tantalising evidence of Saxon occupation, industry and trade, which is probably linked to her abbey. They start digging where some Anglo-Saxon buildings were found back in the 80s, and soon they find something promising.
This is day 12 of our excavation at Barking Abbey. We're looking at a Saxon building. Just this morning I'm discovering that it's starting to look like it's a sunken floor building, like a grub hut perhaps, but maybe a grub hut that's used as a church.
A grub hut is a characteristic Anglo-Saxon building with a sunken floor. So they decide to dig down through this pit, hoping they're on the right track.
I found that.
Oh, nice.
Looks like a rusty old bit of barbed wire, doesn't it? But I'm pretty convinced that that's a copper alloy pin, and it's almost as if that's like a little bird or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe it's something that goes like in a nun's hair or holds a headdress.
So it's a hairpin.
To a hairpin.
This hairpin might be tiny, but it's a potentially prestigious item that could have been worn by a wealthy Anglo-Saxon woman. Then later that day, Graham's expert eye spots something else.
Oh, wow. Just found a little piece of Saxon period glass coming out of the building that we're calling the chapel. And that's probably from the 8th century.
Wow.
Which is exciting.
Yeah.
Archaeologists getting excited about tiny little bits of glass stuff.
There's every reason to be excited. In Anglo-Saxon Britain, glass was a rare luxury. And perhaps not so unexpected here if there was a monastery on this site. The team settle in to comb every inch of this sunken feature because the tiniest piece of evidence could make all the difference. But that afternoon, they find something that tells them far more than they'd ever expected.
We found a piece of Millefiori rod that was on top of a burnt layer.
Oh, that is gorgeous. It really is.
These rods are essentially offcuts from making fine glassware. So this could be powerful evidence that there is a rare Anglo-Saxon glass factory on this site.
We've got evidence of consumption of glassware in the form of glass vessels, but we're now starting to get evidence of production of glasswork in the Saxon period. There's probably less than 5 Saxon period glass production sites in Britain, so to find that really is very exciting.
These finds give us tantalising glimpses of Anglo-Saxon life, but do they confirm the presence of an abbey? The new site director, Kyle, explains more in the lab.
We saw some film of uncovering a grub hut, a kind of sunken floored building. Do you think was it a chapel?
Unfortunately, when we got to the bottom of this supposed sunken feature building, we found some plastic lining. So it turned out that this was backfill.
How frustrating.
It was very frustrating.
Because you're all that digging, thinking you're digging into pristine, stratified layers, and then you get down and find out that it's been disturbed.
Yeah, so we found quite a few nice finds in it as well, which suggested at least these soils were part of the monastery.
So what have we got here?
So here we've got the bird head pin.
Oh, yeah.
So this is quite a high status object. And this here we think is the top of an incense burner. So that kind of ties into the idea that there was sort of a religious ceremony going on.
But I think that, for me, one of the things that really caught my eye and seems quite important is that, which is just a bit of leftover glass from making glass, but it's the fact that they were making glass that's so interesting.
Yeah, no, there's definitely evidence to point towards them making glass in the area, and we know that there was supposedly a glassworking facility around the abbey, but unfortunately we didn't actually find the structure that we're hoping to find.
You know, tantalising glimpses, artefacts that definitely date to the right time period, but as yet Barking Abbey remains a bit elusive. Yeah.
So they have the right finds at Barking, but no monastery. At Coldingham, it's the opposite. Few finds, but possibly a monastery boundary. I've asked Manda Forster into the lab to explain her findings.
So is this your plan from this year?
Yes, so
can you talk me through it? It's quite complicated.
What we're focusing on here, really, in terms of our Anglo-Saxon monastery and looking for Ebba, is this feature here that comes through.
So you think that's the ditch?
Yeah, that is the ditch. And hopefully we'll prove it later. But if you imagine zooming out, where I'm standing, I'm pretty much in the priory grounds.
Yeah. And this is the perimeter.
And this is the perimeter. It's if we could establish that what we do have here is the Valum ditch, and we can start to pull together some more of the evidence that we've seen. If we've got the dates in the right places and we've got small artefacts, these really start to point towards this as being the monastic community for Ebba's site.
And actually, it's the ditch that's
ditch,
more interesting.
The small ditch that was really quietly empty, but with environmental deposits. And that's the thing. I mean, what you don't always get on an archaeological site is tons of material culture, loads of finds that really point to things, and lots of shiny stuff. I mean, sometimes you do just find soil and cuts and features.
Yeah. And how important do you think this monastery and Ebba herself was to the spread of Christianity through
in this
Britain?
area?
Yeah.
She was brought up in a family with 7 brothers, 3 of which were then kings. They set up between them monasteries all over Northumbria. These were real power centres. You know, she was a powerful woman with a large part of an economy around her.
It's fascinating how involved women were in powerful positions in the early Anglo-Saxon church, I think.
It's kind of moment in history where some women were able to really have that kind of equal power with men as well.
Yeah. And I think that's something that disappears later.
Yeah, certainly by the establishment of the Norman religious communities, women can no longer go into the shrine of St Cuthbert, which was around the Norman time. So within a really short space of time, you've got women that are powerful enough to be able to set up monastic communities and to lead and to have this kind of really strong economic position in a society. And then within a couple of 100 years, they can't go into a shrine anymore.
In Anglo-Saxon England, women pretty much had 2 choices: marriage or the church, something that could create a bit of an identity crisis.
One of the tiniest objects in the Norwich Castle Museum reveals this story.
This is a metal detector find that was made in 1998. It's, I think, one of the most remarkable things that we've had brought in through metal detecting in the last 20 years.
What is it?
It's a seal matrix. In other words, the thing that was used to make the impression that makes a seal.
Yeah.
And this was actually within a ring, a gold finger ring, and it would have spun on the gold rod that runs through the centre of it.
So I can just about spot that gold rod there, and has it got a name on it?
It says Baldehildis, or Baltild, which is a female name.
And do we have any idea who this woman is?
We've got one historical figure called Baltild, an Anglo-Saxon, sold into slavery and bought by the mayor of the court in 7th century France. And she then becomes queen, and ultimately she takes on the role of regent, and she rules the kingdom in her own right.
So this historical Baltilda, I mean, she's a really good candidate for the person that would have had an object like this. This is high status. It implies that somebody is literate.
Absolutely, it ticks all of the right boxes.
So why is it on a rod?
It's on a rod so that it actually rotates on that. So you have the public side with her name on it, but if you rotate it, you can see a couple in an intimate embrace beneath a cross.
OK, I wasn't expecting that. But no, it's actually quite rude. I mean, I can see genitals.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it could be an arm coming out very low down on the body, but I don't think it is.
I'm an anatomist, and I think I know what I'm looking at here.
It is a remarkable thing.
But combined with a cross, this seems to be a very peculiar image.
It might suggest something like a betrothal ring. And in this particular case, if she goes into a nunnery, maybe she's therefore a bride of Christ, and that's why she's beneath the cross.
It's quite curious because I think in a single object it almost encapsulates the choices that were there for high status Anglo-Saxon women. You're either a wife and a mother or you're a nun, and it combines those double identities.
It does, and it also speaks of the power of these early women as well. I mean, Baltild is somebody that founds a monastery at Shell, and when she loses political power, sure enough, she's obliged to go into Shell as a nun herself in about 665. And there she remains until she dies in about 680. And then 11 years later, she's pronounced a saint.
Archaeology can reveal entirely new information about our ancestors, as well as giving us a tangible link to people whose stories have been largely forgotten. Getting closer to the physical reality of the monasteries these women founded will hopefully put them back in the picture. This programme has shown how every new excavation forces us to re-evaluate the story of Britain. From discovering how Stone Age people were more prolific monument builders than we ever realised.
That makes it an almost magical experience. The water will be rushing down on either side like a large prehistoric water feature.
To the treatment of slaves after death under Roman rule. And the astounding bravery of the men facing the worst horrors of the First World War. Through archaeology, we are able to reach back and touch their lives.